Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you. Welcome. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli. It is my great honor to greet you on behalf of the Center for Brooklyn History, my colleagues at the Brooklyn Public Library, the library's Board of Trustees and CBH Committee, and BPL's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. There are many distinguished guests in the audience tonight, and I want to welcome you all and thank you for being here. Week in and week out, CBH presents talks and panels in this room that bring to the public expert views on many topics. Octavia Butler's science fiction last week, the state of immigration 2 weeks ago, a look at our long hidden history of enslaved indigenous peoples, which I'm very excited to present later this month. But tonight's discussion is in a category of its own, special both for the people we're honored to welcome and the importance of the dialogue given where we find our country today. Historian Eric Foner's influence on fellow historians and his impact on how all of us think about our nation's history is hard to overstate. He's published dozens of influential books: Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, The Fiery Trial, winner of the Pulitzer, Bancroft, and Lincoln Prizes, Gateway to Freedom, The Second Founding. And if you include editions, edited volumes, and so on, you'll find well over 100 publications under his name that bring perspective to the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and in particular, how the legacy of slavery, what he has often described as, quote, our country's unhealed wound, continues to shape American society, politics, and race relations. Eric Foner's newest work is a collection of essays titled Our Fragile Freedoms. Leading him in conversation about our fragile freedoms tonight is a scholar we are also profoundly honored to welcome here, Andrew Delbanco, Alexander Hamilton Professor of American Studies at Columbia University and president of the Teagle Foundation. Professor Delbanco's most recent book, The War Between the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul, is a New York Times notable book, was awarded an Anisfield Wolf Prize for, quote, books that have made important contributions to our understanding of racism and human diversity, the Lionel Trilling Award, and Mark Linton History Prize, sponsored by the Columbia Journalism School and the Nieman Foundation at Harvard. Both of these giants have been presented with one extraordinary award after another, but I'm going to limit mention to just one, because number one, they both shared it at different years, and number two, it pretty much says it all. They are both recipients of the Great Teacher Award, presented by the Society of Columbia Graduates. Following their discussion, we will have time for some questions from the audience. Our ushers will bring the mic to you in your seats. Please help us out by standing to ask your question and speaking clearly into the microphone. The book, Our Fragile Freedoms, is available to buy at the CBH shop, which is over there in the corner, and Professor Foner will sign copies at the front of the room following the program. It is an absolute thrill and honor to host you both tonight. Thank you for bringing this conversation to the Center for Brooklyn History. Please help me welcome Eric Foner and Andrew Delbanco.
So good evening, everybody. I think I'm sort of in the MC role tonight, so I'll start off with a few brief comments and then we'll begin a conversation. Frankly, I'm a little embarrassed by the double billing of tonight's occasion, because I'm really, to let you in on a secret, I'm really an English professor masquerading as an historian, whereas Eric Foner is a real historian, like maybe the realest of our historians, and it's a great honor to be on the platform with him tonight. It takes a lot for Upper West Siders like ourselves to come to Brooklyn, but this invitation was irresistible, so here we are. We're going to talk about history, we're going to talk about Eric's new book, but I think it's inevitable that we're also going to talk about the present, and I suspect the present is very much on all your minds. So let me start in that vein. I know a little about the 1850s. Eric knows a great deal about the 1850s. And I'm not going to be the first person to suggest that some of the features of those years before the Civil War, a paralyzed Congress, a Supreme Court that handed down the hideous Dred Scott decision denying that black people even had the right to be in court, that there are certain ominous echoes in our own moment, whether it's the repeal of Roe v. Wade or the way Congress is functioning now. So my question, Eric, is it irresponsible to think that the period we're living in right now bears some marks of similarity to that pre-Civil War period?
I think, Andy, that you are pointing to some similarities between then and now, and I would even go further than the list that you proposed here. There have always been Americans of one kind or another who, talk into the microphone, excellent advice. There have always been Americans who think there is too much democracy in this country, even though when Alexis de Tocqueville came here around 1830 to visit, he realized, he came to talk about American prisons, but he realized he had the wrong subject for his book, that democracy was the question for people who wanted to understand the United States. But there are many, there have always been groups of Americans who have tried to restrict immigration or have simply not wanted immigrants to be here. There have been many thousands, although we don't hear about this right now, who have been expelled or deported long in the 1930s, so-called Operation Wetback. A couple of 100,000 people from Mexico were deported from the United States. I don't have to mention the fact that racial inequality is something that has persisted in many forms, in many places in our history. Of course, one can list some of the differences, many differences between the 1850s, that is the decade before the Civil War, and previous time periods where it just seemed like the democratic system was under assault or even collapsing in some ways. So I think it is possible to pinpoint elements of our current situation which are dangerous and undemocratic, and everybody knows if they pick up the newspaper what is going on in the country day by day. I don't want to reiterate what everybody already knows. But the other point I want to make is that we have a constitution. It is perhaps flawed in certain ways. As Jill Lepore has pointed out in a new book, there have been many efforts to amend the Constitution, which hasn't happened much over the whole course of American history. But what James Madison spoke, the father of the Constitution, spoke of parchment barriers. It's a phrase I like to repeat. What does that mean? Parchment barriers that guarantees on paper of the right to vote or of citizenship rights or the freedom of speech. He didn't think much of the Bill of Rights in a way. That is to say, he approved passing it because that was part of a deal to get the Constitution ratified. But he made it clear he didn't think that just on paper rights were going to do the trick in protecting people's rights. And you need more than that. Parchment barriers are not going to stop those who have an authoritarian streak. I could go on and on here. I'm just going to mention, because it is so central to my own historical writing, another parallel, of course, of the whole 19th century is Reconstruction and the overturn of Reconstruction and the Jim Crow system, which has, the Jim Crow system, which replaced Reconstruction. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, an abolitionist who commanded one of the first units of African American soldiers in the Civil War, Higginson said at one point, revolutions may go backward. Revolutions may go back. We are seeing a revolution going backward right now, where gains that have made by different groups in terms of acceptance as good patriotic Americans are being overturned. The whole idea of equality is under assault in Washington and in many states. So I guess I'm not quite saying that there's nothing new under the sun, but I think if you look at the long trajectory of American history, you will find parallels to many of the policies that we hear about today if we pick up our newspaper. That doesn't mean this is inevitably going to continue forever. It does mean that we can't fall into a kind of a cozy relationship with the government where you know very well, Andy, as an English professor, the famous quote from Lionel Trilling in the around 1950, where he said, there are no ideas really in America today except liberal ones, right? Liberal ideas were triumphant, and he's talking about liberalism in a slightly different way, but I'm not going to go into that. But the point that there is, that is not the case. It's not the case that there's only liberal ideas in American history. And I think if we look back, we will find many examples of attacks on or criticism of democracy, to find a shorter, clearer word. So I've been rambling on here. I'm going to stop, except to say, yes, there are parallels, and they're dangerous ones.
Right. So, couple reactions to what Eric said, if I may, and then a question that I think follows on this. I think Trilling said that there are no conservative ideas. There are only irritable gestures passing as conservative ideas. Well, we're living through a hell of a irritable gesture right now, though I don't know whether conservative is quite the right word to describe what we're experiencing. The second reaction to what you said, I'm sure it's in the minds of many of you. It's really hard right now, but it probably usually is hard as we're living through this to believe what Dr. King so famously said, that the arc of history bends toward justice, ultimately towards justice. And I do think in order to ensure that those protections are not parchment protections, it's really critical that the public continues to believe that history can bend toward justice. And we all, I don't mean to preach at you here, but we all ought to do our part to ensure that that's possible. One other reaction, just sort of random comment. On my way over here, I was making the mistake of reading the news on my phone, and I see that the president, whose name I'm going to try not to mention, is speaking now of a domestic insurrection. Talking about invoking the Insurrection Act in order to send troops to a major American city. And hearing that, I found myself thinking, well, when Mr. Lincoln used the term domestic insurrection,
yes,
he was talking about armed forces of the state of South Carolina firing on a federal installation for what, 24 hours or something like that. So one reason it helps to think about history a little bit is it puts things into a certain perspective, and it helps you to see how preposterous the use of that term is at the present time.
Well, you know, my view is that those who are critical of the policies that our government is implementing have kind of dropped the ball in terms of mobilizing opposition and appealing to more elevated ideas, Lincoln's, you know, the last best hope of man and things like that. But again, you can find, I can list for you 10 or 20 political leaders who fit the bill of authoritarianism, of racism, of hostility to nativism, hostility to immigration. I mean, you could start with Andrew Johnson, who was central to overthrowing Reconstruction after the Civil War. You can talk about Huey Long, who was an odd case in the sense that he tried somewhat to bring some public benefits to black Louisianans as well as white ones. Andrew Jackson, who sort of intuited the I'm looking for my right word here, the latent power, that's what the latent power of the presidency. Mm-hmm. Up to Andrew Jackson, the president had not actually been that powerful an office, although Thomas Jefferson in the Louisiana Purchase certainly appealed to, you know, rights and ideas that were not really were not there in the Constitution. And also, you mentioned this briefly a few minutes ago, I think, when Dred Scott, the Supreme Court in both periods has abdicated its responsibility. Now, one might say, what do you expect? I mean, in the sense that President Trump, you know, put on the court several members, all of whom seemed to reflect his particular view of American politics. But the role of the Supreme Court in our history is a fairly shabby and not very desirable one. Liberals, or whatever you call them, radicals, have gotten into the habit of saying, oh, the Supreme Court will fix this, don't worry. There are cases going on right now where anybody with any sense of honesty at all would say, no, the government's policy is wrong. I'm talking here about Trump's notion that he can unilaterally repeal the first section of the 14th Amendment, which creates citizenship for anybody born in the United States. It does not take a lot of brain power to understand what that means and who it makes into a citizen, anybody born in the United States. And this was a direct response to Dred Scott, which you mentioned, because according to the Dred Scott decision, no black person could be a citizen, regardless of where they were born or where they lived, etc. So there are plenty of examples in our history of authoritarianism and disrespect for the Constitution and things like that. And I think it's good, if there's anything good out of this, it's good that we are now forced to confront the complicated history of the United States, which is not simply liberalism, it's not simply more and more freedom for people, it's not simply any of those things, even though that's often taught in grade schools, the straight line of freedom in American history. No, it's much more crooked, that line. It goes up and back. Revolutions may go backward, said Higginson.
So let me ask you one more sort of then and now question, taking you back to your first book, which is a very good book about the formation of the Republican Party, right? Free soil, free labor, free men, right?
Yes, you passed the test.
Okay. It'd save us about 50 years ago, I think, that book, or a little more.
Even longer.
So the Republican Party came into being out of the ashes of the Whig Party, and it was a kind of coalition or hybrid or mixture. It had nationalists and nativists and abolitionists and all kinds of factions that grouped together to form a new party. And the Republican Party of our own moment is it hasn't jettisoned its name. It still calls itself the Republican Party, but it bears very little relationship, certainly to the Republican Party of the mid-19th century, and even very little relationship to the Republican Party of sort of Wall Street conservatism of some few years ago. It's become a protectionist party, an anti-immigrant party, and so on. So the Democratic Party, in the meantime, which used to be thought of as the working class party, now is increasingly construed as the party representing the interests of elite intellectuals. So what's going on here? Are we in the middle of a reformation of the party system? Do you anticipate a third party, or what do you imagine?
It's not impossible. I mean, as you know, historians don't like to predict the future. One of the reasons for that is almost every important event in history has come as a big surprise. So you can't just take the present and push it forward in a straight line and say this is what is going to happen now in the next 20, 30 years. I think, there are grounds for hope or optimism in some ways. If you just look at the trajectory of American history, lame ducks, which is what President Trump is, the parties of lame ducks almost always lose votes in the midterm elections. Everyone knows that. It may very well happen again. In fact, there's good reason to think it will happen again. So the political system itself seems to have some self-correcting characteristics. It's hard for them to get implemented, especially because, as I mentioned, the latent power of the presidency. Trump has unilaterally declared that anytime he says there's emergency, that kind of abrogates all the previous laws and constitutional amendments, and he can do all sorts of crazy things as long as he said there's an emergency. And his definition of an emergency is very, promiscuous, that anytime there's a few people from some other place trying to get into the United States, that's an emergency which requires troops to stop it, etc. I would like to see us come back to go forward, I guess, to these tendencies which have always been there in American history: the anti-democratic tendency, the nativist tendency, the racist tendency, and others. It's Trump is drawing on some of those, not all, but some, although, as Andy just mentioned, one principle of the early Republican Party was high tariffs. The tariff back when I was teaching, I retired recently, if a student would walk into my office and said, I want to do a dissertation on the tariff, and I would say, you're crazy. Nobody cares about tariffs. And, you'll never get a job writing about the tariff. Now, people walk in, they say, I'm going to write a really good book about the tariff and its history, so things change in strange ways.
Indeed. Tariff has bestseller written all over it. Let me ask you one more, sort of about another sort of a party, the populist party, which you mention from time to time in your book. So here was a party that had a lot of progressive tendencies. It was also, as your mentor Richard Hofstadter pointed out, infected by anti-Semitism and nativism and all kinds of forms, xenophobia, all kinds of forms. So it was a mixed bag. Now, populist is a word you can't avoid it. Everybody's saying the populists are back, the populists are in charge in this country and they're in other countries. So what do you take it to mean? What is a populist?
I don't like the way the word populist is used by journalists and others as a sort of a form of explanation for many of the things going on today. It's considered, journalists consider whatever, Trump is but the term is applied to people who often have nothing whatsoever in common with each other. And it's applied in other countries. O'Brien is a populist supposedly in Hungary, and other world leaders who seem to be representing the ordinary people, or at least claim to be representing that. I think the idea of that what we're envisioning now is a new wave of populism is not really correct. The populist platform of 1892, one of the great radical documents of American history, the populist platform of 1892 started off by talking about how the rich were dominating the political system and moving on from there. And that's not populism, as I understand it, to talk about the richest people in the country and how they're distorting the democratic process. Hofstadter, right, Richard Hofstadter, my mentor as a graduate student in history long ago, he didn't much like the populists. He thought, they were the inspiration for his essays or books, The Paranoid Style in American History, or Anti-Intellectualism in American History, which Hofstadter thought that anti-intellectualism was a very dangerous phenomenon. And it certainly seems to resonate today, this notion of anti-intellectualism and lack of respect for expertise, lack of willingness to challenge the so-called populist tendencies. As I say, I don't like using populist the way it is used today by many. But as I said before, I think there is certainly grounds for hope that the midterm elections will perhaps lead to a reversal of some of the trends going on right now.
I believe there's a phrase, from your lips to God's ear, something like that. Let me delve a little bit into the book, which is the immediate reason why Eric is here tonight. I believe there are books to be bought and signed by the author after our discussion. If the tables were turned, I always like if the MC promotes the book. So I'm happy to promote this book because it's a wonderful book, and I wanna pull two threads out of it for a moment. There are a lot of wonderful pieces in it. Eric, you described the book as largely a collection of book reviews. And, your first reaction might be, well, book reviews, why? But by reading these book reviews, you can follow the significant trends in American historiography over the last quarter century. And that makes it a really coherent and valuable book. Now, you have in there a short piece, I don't think you published it in The Nation, maybe, called A Letter to Bernie. And my reading of that is that you're saying to Senator Sanders, look, part of the problem with the movement you're trying to create is that people are allergic to the term socialism. It's a toxic term. So in order to advance your program, we need to find a way to sort of neutralize the toxicity of that term, and you propose that we embrace our own homegrown domestic radical tradition. One of your early books is a book about Tom Paine. So can you talk a little bit about why it seems so hard for Americans to acknowledge that we do have a strong left tradition in this country? It's not all about dog-eat-dog capitalism, never has been. Why is that hard?
That's a very good question and observation. I think,
Mike.
yes, I think it's hard for a number of reasons. One, I hate to say it, is that the more conservative bent in our history often has some connection with racism. I've always found it hard to understand or explain how groups of Americans, conservatives, libertarians, etc., can identify sympathetically with the Confederacy, whose whole purpose was to maintain slavery. And yet, even now, lately Trump has said he's going to take down statues, or he's going to put up statues of political leaders, and some of them are Confederate. Robert E. Lee is going up there again with his horse Traveler, who will be buried with him. But, yes.
Mike. Yeah.
I have to talk in this. Okay, good point. My letter to Bernie was a letter within the left. That is to say, it was by people who sympathize with Senator Bernie Sanders, don't let the 1% rule the country, that kind of thing. But when asked about what does democratic socialism mean, and we, of course, have that issue right now again with the mayoral race, when Bernie was asked, what is this democratic socialism you talk about? He said it's sort of, it's kind of sort of like Denmark, maybe Scandinavia. And I wrote, and I said, you should have American examples, not just Scandinavian examples. Nothing wrong with Danes and Swedes and all those. But, you should talk about Tom Paine. You should talk about Frederick Douglass. You should talk about Eugene Debs. We have great people in our history who have devoted their lives to making this a better country. And I wrote this article in The Nation magazine about how Bernie should give us a trajectory, a usable past is what is often.
And I believe you even included Franklin Roosevelt in that list.
Yes, Roosevelt, of course.
Which is, that Franklin Roosevelt now appears, by contrast to our current politics, to be a radical.
Right. Well, yes, we don't have the good neighbor policy anymore, right? Roosevelt.
But let me follow up something. You mentioned General Lee and his horse.
Yes.
And the monuments are sort of going back up, or they're no longer pulling them down. You also have a very nice piece in the book about the monuments issue. And if I remember it correctly, you come to a kind of quiet, softly stated conclusion that maybe it's not sufficient or even wise to focus on pulling down the monuments, as noxious as they are, all those, monuments to Confederate heroes that went up in the years after Reconstruction, which were all in the face of black people. This is what the South is all about, and don't you forget it. But maybe the solution isn't to pull them down, but to put up other monuments next to them, celebrating Reconstruction and celebrating the Civil Rights Movement, so that the public will have a more complex understanding of American history.
Right. I did say that in the book. As Professor Delbanco mentioned, the book is really a collection of essays, 5 or 6 pages, each one or something. What's bad about that is it doesn't have a narrative coherence. But what's good about it is you can just pick it up and read for 10 minutes, and you've actually gotten something out of that, because the book reviews are a certain length, and et cetera, et cetera. But as to Bernie, I'm told, was not happy with my critique of his Scandinavian politics. But we do have important radical traditions in this country, and there's no reason why we should run away from them or refuse to countenance them. Who was it? Adam Gopnik, I think, in the New York Times, when David Blight's, or in the New Yorker, when David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass was published, Gopnik wrote an essay, "Was Frederick Douglass the greatest American?" And I don't know how you judge that, but he certainly accomplished a lot and was a person of immense talent and things like that. But to say that, a black man being the greatest American ever, to my mind, opens the door to considering other kinds of people to be put on that list of who the great Americans were.
So I think we might have one more question, then we'll turn to the audience. I want to ask you something about teaching.
Yes.
Because Marcia was kind to say that we both take teaching seriously, and I think that's true, and I know from many people what an impact you've had on generations of students. The question I have, and it came to my mind in reading the Monuments essay, is how do you make sure in your classes that students do come away with a complex sense of the past? And part of that, I think, imposes a responsibility on the teacher to have them read interpretations that are at odds with each other. How do you approach that?
Well, how do you inspire? How do you inspire students to want to learn, to want to read? I mean, teachers have been confronting that question for a long time, as you well know. I think the key, and this is a cliche, but the key is your own enthusiasm for the subject. If everybody here is really interested in history and wants to learn more history, they're going to go out and read, whether it's my book or some other book, a good history book. I think that's how we maintain interest in history. The interest in history has been diminishing lately in college classrooms, fewer history majors at major universities, et cetera. But, my mentor was Hofstadter, as I said. He was a terrible teacher. I'm sorry, Richard, but or more to the point, he didn't like teaching. And the students picked that up very quickly. And in fact, he actually said to me once, "I am a writer. I teach to earn a living." So that's not going to develop a love of history among students, that kind of attitude. He would stand before the podium and just read in a monotone the chapters from his next forthcoming book.
Yeah.
And wherever, when the bell rang, he stopped, put it away, and that was
Yeah.
the end of that.
Yeah, it's not a model of good teaching, but
But he was very good
yeah,
in critiquing essay writing.
yeah.
If I gave him a chapter, he was very good in pointing out what was wrong with it.
Yeah, and it has to be said that the chapters he read were really good.
Oh, thank you.
That was, if I'm, one more, and this is probably a really unfair question. If you want to avoid it, that's fine. It's kind of a meta question. Why should people care about history?
No, that is not an easy question to answer. You're right. Why should people care about history? This book begins with a little epigraph on the front page. I may not have this exactly right. It's a quotation from a guy named Robert G. Fitzgerald, a free black person who lived in North Carolina, and after the Civil War, and fought in the Union Army, and then also after the Civil War, set up a school for emancipated slaves in North Carolina. What did he say? He said, the past, I have to get the middle straight, or maybe someone can have the book, it doesn't matter. The past is it's like the index of the future and the mirror of what will come, something like that. It's not accurate, not 100% right, but it's a shrewd comment. And if you do get the book, look at the very first page, and Fitzgerald's comment about history is like that. You know, one can give the probably conventional answer, this is a democracy, we need to have educated citizens, we need to have people who understand our political system, and are galvanized to protect our liberties when it comes to those who would take them away. I'm not sure that I can add much more to that, except to say that the study of history helps you. This is what I say to the parents of students who are afraid their kid will never get a job because they're a history major. It's quite clear that studying history gives you the skills which will be of great benefit in your future life, the ability to mobilize information, the ability to judge the veracity of different kinds of information and misinformation, of which there's quite a bit nowadays. I think the democratic system requires informed citizens. I mean, that's what, and our citizens today are not as interested in history, although, despite having said that, look at the New York Times bestseller list this past week. There's history book, serious history on there.
Yeah.
Jill Lepore, other people like that who are good historians, and that's great. I think it's wonderful that they're on the bestseller list.
Yeah.
So at least there is considerable interest in history out there, and I hope that will continue.
Yeah. Well, needless to say, the gentleman to my right has done more than almost anybody to ensure, and through your books, through your teaching, through your textbooks, to ensure that American citizens do have a real understanding of our history, and for that, I think we're all grateful. So I think we have a few minutes for question, and I believe there's going to be a microphone going around, and then please speak directly into the mic and slowly and loudly, if you don't mind, because it's hard to hear up here.
It's been said that history is so perspectival that it's little different than simply commentary. There are so many lies that we've been taught about history. I think Kenneth Roberts Oliver Wiswell is a more accurate description of America's War of Independence than what we're taught in the schools. World War II was an outgrowth of World War I. We never discussed that. And so I wonder, is history just commentary? Is it just your opinion? Do you just select, Trump and his minions talk about alternative facts. There's something to that.
I confess I had trouble hearing. Did you get that, Eric?
Yeah, not entirely. Let me ask. Yes, I do have hearing aids which don't work all that well. And normally when I'm in a situation like this, I try to have the moderator summarize the question.
Well,
So,
my pleasure. Right. Well, I think I honestly had trouble hearing it myself. I think there was something toward the end of the question about whether the writing of history is merely a form of commentary and sort of opinionating, or whether there's something of some objectivity in the writing of history. I think something like that was in the question.
well, the writing of history, I guess it was Oscar Wilde, who's always quotable, he said, what was any idiot can make history. It takes a genius to write it. So the other Oscar Wildean, of course, was the only obligation we have to history is to rewrite it. And the rewriting of history is indeed essential to the study of history. There are many people who kind of have the idea that history is unchangeable. There's just a bunch of facts and narratives, and they consider changes in historical interpretation as sort of dangerous in some sort of way. A French writer, Ernest Renan, back in the 1880s or 1890s, explained why the notion of revisionist history is considered dangerous. He said it's because every nation, every people grounds their identity in some vision of history. It may be mythological in some forms, but people who are interested in history pick it up and use it for nationalist purposes. That I think it was Nietzsche who said there are three kinds of history. There's antiquarian history, it was sort of like tracing your family tree. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not fully history. You have that. You have what he called monumental history, which is Robert E. Lee and his horse. And then the third one was critical history. And that, he said, is the history that judges and condemns. In other words, he didn't want history just to be a celebration of the nation state, although that's what it often is. He didn't want he didn't want to be accused of somehow undermining and disrupting the nation. The notion of historians as quote unquote enemies of the people goes back a long way, and Trump has picked it up. But it's because people who say that don't like to see revisionist ideas about history, which they fear will undermine people's identification with the national myth or maybe the national interpretation that attracts people to the notion of America as the example of liberty for the entire world.
Right. So Gone with the Wind is a more palatable story than the true story of the antebellum South.
Yes.
Yeah. I have to wait for the mic to arrive somewhere. Okay.
Yes, the mic is here.
FedEx will bring it, yeah.
I hate to differ with Professor Foner, but I do in your advice to Bernie Sanders. I think Frederick Douglass and the other people you mentioned are admirable and important figures, but they were not democratic socialists. And I don't think we have any powerful or successful democratic socialists in our history. And he was correct in looking to Scandinavia and other places for models.
The questioner is differing with you and says, I think if I understood it in your letter to Bernie, that we don't, the questioner says, have a genuine tradition of democratic socialism in this country. And I don't know whether the point is we should or we shouldn't, but we don't.
Well, that was one of the reasons I said to Bernie, use American examples, because the more you rely on extra American examples, the more you're actually playing into the notion that radicalism is a foreign import and that there's no indigenous radical tradition, but there's a different one that at least has some bearing on American history, but not that much. I don't believe that studying history is the way to change the society. Very often students used to come to see me, I know they probably did with you also, and say, I want to change things, but I also love to study history. So how can I do, can I do both? Should I do both? Is there a danger in pouring your, partisanship into the vessel of history? Is it, some kind of revisionism which just pushes aside conventional historical analysis? I'm prejudiced on this, obviously, but I think the study of history is something that ought to be emphasized more in schools. You know of what's going on in schools very well from your work, I think one of the problems with history is there isn't enough of it, that many states have cut back on the requirements for studying history to get a high school diploma or things like that. We're at a moment when education is praised, for helping you get a good job. I'm not here to say that reading a good history book is going to immediately get you a good job. Probably not. But, that notion is part of our culture today, that the way to get, the way to do these things is through the job search.
Yeah. Well, it prompts me to remember that I think one of the first public statements from Mr. Lincoln when he was running for local office in like 1832 or something like that, was about the enormous importance of education, and he was very specific about what he meant by education. And of course, he was a guy who didn't have any diplomas, but he had read a lot of books. And he said to encourage our citizens to read the history of our country and other countries so they can understand, by implication, the fragility of our free institutions. And that was, I think, really...
Lyceum speech?
No, it's even before the Lyceum speech.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have time for just one more question, and it's back here.
Professor, I was curious if you could talk at all about the unitary executive theory that seems to be animating so much of the change that is happening at the Supreme Court and seems to be underlying the president's exercise of power in all sorts of ways.
The question is whether you have a comment about the so-called unitary executive theory.
Yes, okay, right.
By which the power of the presidency seems to be almost unlimited.
Well, let's start off by pointing out that in the Constitution, where it lists or delineates the three branches of government, Number one is the Congress, not the presidency, and not anything else, the judiciary. Congress is supposed to be the most powerful of the branches of government, but the current Congress doesn't do anything. They passed this giant bill that Trump pushed through a couple of months ago, but in addition to that, there's nothing. And there are some pretty serious problems facing our country, which maybe some people who are knowledgeable can help to solve them. But yes, this notion of the unitary executive. You know, the role of the president during the Constitutional Convention and then the ratification process for the Constitution, much of the debate was about the presidency. Should there be a presidency? Isn't this a kind of monarchical thing to have a president with significant powers? We don't want that anymore. Hamilton, of course, who went the other way, said the greatest leader in history was Julius Caesar. So I don't think that got into the musical, actually, but
right. No, that didn't play.
Yeah.
Right.
And, but the notion that the president can do anything he wants because he or she is the president is nowhere to be found in the Constitution. Many things that have happened lately are nowhere to be found in the Constitution in the same way. I'm not an admirer of this unitary executive theory, which gives it's authoritarianism, oligarchism. I don't know, but it gives to Americans a very misleading idea about what their government is structured to try to achieve. So I hope that bites the dust along with various other pseudo-constitutional theories which are floating around right now.
Let us hope. Thank you all very, very much for coming.